Welcome, everyone. I'm Zahra Ebrahim. I have the honor and privilege of being the board chair of Park People and the honor and privilege of getting to facilitate the launch of our Canadian City Parks Report for 2022, the culmination of so much hard and brilliant work and thoughtful, compassionate work of the team you're going to hear from today. So I'm really, really excited to be moderating this conversation and to really celebrate this launch. I think the team will talk about sort of, the history of this report, I think, for those of you who are new to it. But, we've been doing this for a number of years. And each year I notice just from the things that I hear that the depth continues to evolve. And that certainly happened this year. So we're going to spend this very, very quick 60 minutes together is that we're going to hear a 20-minute presentation of the key findings, top stories, and insights from this year's report. And then we'll have a moderated discussion. And please, throughout the presentation or the discussion, post any questions you may have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You're probably familiar with that, but if you're not, it's right at the bottom beside where you find the chat and share screen function. And for those joining from our Francophone communities, we're offering French simultaneous interpretation of today's webinar. So if you'd like to take advantage of this offering, the French audio room option is at the bottom of the screen, down there where the Q&A boxes are. And that should bring you to the French audio room where you'll hear our amazing interpreter, Jennifer. So I'll give folks a minute for those folks who want to switch over to the French room. And just to let people know that today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on our Canadian City Parks, on the Park People Canadian City Parks Report website for future reference. So you can, watch it over and over again, as we all will for the rest of the year until the next report. And so at Park People, we're really committed to ensuring that city parks support healthy and resilient and vibrant communities and ecosystems, and with a particular focus on equity deserving groups. And this year, I think, we've said this for the last few years, but, this year in this, whatever we're calling it, a transition, a sort of emergence, but a shifting, we wanted to really honor the fact that parks have played such a vital role in nurturing and repairing relationships between each other, who we haven't seen sometimes for some of us in a while, for our communities, and for the wider natural world that we're in relation with. So we wanted to start with a land acknowledgement and do more than honoring just the land, but also recognizing that we're talking about parks today. And expressing our deep, deep gratitude for its critical connection to the health and well-being and connection of all of us. This land acknowledgement that I'm going to give today is formulated for Toronto, where the head office of Park People is, where I am today. And so please remember, though, that the land acknowledgement is a personal recognition of who you are and your relationship to the land on which you find yourself and your responsibility to that land. And so with this in mind, if you are located anywhere that is not in Toronto, we encourage you to make this land acknowledgement personal to you, and you can do that in the chat by going to nativeland.ca or sharing anything that you want to share about how you are trying to build a more nurturing and reciprocal relationship with the land that you are residing on. Park People acknowledges that the land that we call home sits on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, and the Chippewa people, and is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. In the context of our discussion today, it feels especially important to recognize that even this notion of parks is part of a legacy of Indigenous displacement that has led to the creation of all of these spaces that we find so much respite and connection in. And just wanted to note that there's a broader subtext to this, the historical role of urban planning and settler colonialism and dispossession has been part of sort of creating these spaces that we really cherish. In this conversation and in our work at Park People, it is our responsibility to guide and implement practices and policies that uphold and restore Indigenous relationships to the land. And we really hope that this acknowledgement invites us all to reflect individually and collectively, because part of the work is getting into the mindset of collectivism, to reflect on the ongoing colonial injustices in our park systems and bring awareness to that in our conversation today. So if you haven't already, let us know who you are in the chat window, what nation's territory you're visiting us from, your connection to that land, maybe an offering to that land, something that you're committing to in your day-to-day life, whether it be in your personal or work life. And maybe I'll just do a very quick plug. We do have an amazing conference coming up in September, and you'll hear all about that via email and social media and all these other platforms. But connected to the land acknowledgement, yesterday I will have the pleasure of moderating one of the sessions, or two or three of the sessions actually, at the Park People Conference this year. And I got to speak with one of our amazing speakers who is one of the keepers of the healing forest in Winnipeg yesterday. And she said something really amazing when we spoke a few times yesterday, and she said, just to remind ourselves that there is no other who's going to do the work of repair and healing. And so just as you think about your own land acknowledgement, that there's no waiting for someone else. I think it's an invitation to each of us to just get to work. So you're not going to hear too much from me today, hopefully. We're mostly going to hear from our three amazing panelists and report authors, Adri Stark, Emily Riddle, and Jake Tobin Garrett. I'm so excited to share the space with today. Their bios are going to show up in the chat. Their amazing bios are going to show up in the chat, and we're not going to put them through having to sit through having their bios read out. But we'll just share a little bit about each of them, and then we'll pass the floor over to them for a quick presentation. So Adri is a project manager specializing in research and policy at Park People and the co-author of the Canadian City Parks Report. She leads Park People's research on encampments and has co-authored reports on the social impact of parks and factors that elicit a sense of belonging in public space, and so much more. Adri has done so much cool stuff, and that is a snapshot. Emily is a member of the Alexander First Nation in Treaty 6. She is a writer, editor, public library worker, and researcher, and sits on the board of advisors for the Yellowhead Institute, a First Nations-led think tank. And Jake is a writer, illustrator, and public space policy and research consultant. He was previously Park People's manager of policy and planning and continues to work with the organization as a consultant, and also does incredible illustrations and drawings that you should also check out online. So the fourth author of our 2022 Canadian City Parks Report is Nikita Longman. She is a Saulteaux woman from the George Gordon First Nation in Treaty 4 territory. She obtained a Bachelor of Arts in English degree from First Nations University of Canada and continues to grow her writing portfolio as a freelance writer. So I will just say before I pass the floor to these brilliant minds that we have some of the smartest people on parks and ways in which that parks can be a force of connection and healing and resilience and all the things we want to see in our cities and communities. And these three they have such deep expertise in the Canadian context, but also more broadly in North America. So I know personally, it is a joy and an honor to be part of the Park People community because I get to be around this amazing insights and knowledge. And we're just so lucky to have their expertise on our team. So I am going to pass the floor to our illustrious panelists, and then we'll go into a discussion. So over to you folks.
Thanks so much for opening us up, Zahra, and thank you all for joining us. I think I speak for all of us when I say we're really excited to share this year's findings with you all, and hope you'll be able to take away some new perspectives on parks by the end of our conversation today. So for those of you who are new to the Canadian City Parks Report, each year the report tracks trends and challenges in city parks across the country, and this is our 4th year of the report. So this year's report includes data, policies, and practices from our survey of parks departments in 30 cities, all the way from Vancouver on the West Coast to Charlottetown on the East. And the goal is really to share Canadian practices, establish a common database, and inspire action by spotlighting creative solutions to some of the most pressing issues facing parks each year. In addition to our municipal survey, we also do a public survey. So this year we heard from residents, or over 3,000 residents of Canadian cities, just to understand the public's experiences in parks over the past year. And then in addition to the surveys, we also conducted interviews with over 30 experts, including community members, activists, city staff, landscape architects, academics, nonprofit staff, and more, just to dig into different perspectives on park issues. So this is all to say that the report is really a collaborative effort between ourselves, city staff, and the experts who take the time to speak with us. And I think many of them are probably tuned into today's webinar. So thank you all so much, and just wanted to take a moment to recognize all the folks who make the report possible. This also includes our funders, so a huge thank you to the Weston Family Foundation. They've not only funded this year's report, but all 4 years, and without their support, we wouldn't be able to do this work. We also want to thank RBC Insurance, Norton Rose Fulbright, and Mohari Hospitality for their support. So as you can imagine, there's a lot in this report, and I won't get to everything today, but Emily, Jake, and I are just going to open things up with an overview of some key findings before we move into a bit more of a discussion, as Zahra mentioned. So as many of us have probably observed throughout the pandemic, we've seen higher levels of park use, and this is really a key trend that we've documented in the past 2 years of the Canadian City Parks Report. And we're seeing this continue into 2022. So 55% of city residents told us that they spent more time in parks this year than the year prior. And on top of that, 58% actually said that they'd like to spend even more time in parks than they do currently. And similarly, people are continuing to appreciate the benefits of parks. So 94% of city residents said that parks improved their mental health this year, which is actually up almost 10% from 85% last year. So what all of these stats tell us is that the increased use and appreciation of parks that began early in the pandemic is very much showing itself to be a sustained trend. And this may be related to the fact that many people discovered new uses of parks during the pandemic. So 93% of city residents said that they started a new activity in parks during COVID that they're still doing now. And this includes things like going for more frequent walks along trails, eating outdoors, meeting up with friends in parks, and so on. So people really picked up all of these new park routines that have stuck around and become sort of a lasting and ongoing part of their everyday lives.
Thanks, Adri. So we know that people have sought out nature more during the pandemic in the last couple of years for rest and stress reduction and exercise. This year, we found nearly half of survey respondents said that a new activity they picked up during the pandemic was spending more time in natural areas. Additionally, 54% of residents said they visit wild or naturalized park spaces most often, which is actually up from 20% from the 2021 survey. So this actually translates to a pretty large number of folks, we think, who are spending more time seeking out experiences of nature in the city than they were pre-pandemic. And this isn't just large natural areas either. So not just like the big parks in cities or at the edges of cities. 71% of respondents actually said that they sought out smaller naturalized spaces like a native plant garden or maybe a small meadow that was in a 10-minute walk of their home. And I think this really highlights the importance of naturalizing spaces within neighborhoods, closer to where people live, closer to people's homes, which also helps increase, of course, urban biodiversity, creates natural habitat in some of these more dense urban areas, and comes with a whole host of climate benefits around stormwater management and retention and reducing the urban heat island effect. The other thing that we saw was this sort of increased contact with nature is actually leading to more interest in giving back through natural stewardship. So nearly 60% of cities said that they had created new or that they had actually expanded some of their existing nature stewardship programs. And one city actually told us that they had to pause intake of volunteers because the nature stewardship program they had was so popular they couldn't actually take on any more volunteers. So, there's a big opportunity here for city staff, for nonprofit organizations and community groups to really kind of connect people more to the natural environment in their cities and really facilitate this sort of growing interest in giving back. And I'll just pass it over to Emily for the next bit.
Thanks, Jake. Nikita Longman, who you heard a little bit about, and I were the guest contributors this year, and we were really honored to write stories for the inclusion section. This section covered topics such as engaging with Indigenous leadership, plants, naming, ceremonial sites, and other topics. There's a lot of work being done in collaboration with Indigenous communities in Canada on parks, and a lot of work still to be done to address Indigenous displacement and dispossession. My particular story was about the resurgence and protection of Indigenous plants in city parks. And we found that 87% of respondents would like to see more Indigenous plants in those parks, which was awesome and surprising. And a few other notable statistics that we found in surveys was that 68% of respondents would like to see more Indigenous representation in parks, and then 59% are in favor of renaming parks to restore Indigenous place names. Thank you.
So on to paying for parks. This is one of the perennial issues we've seen over the last 4 years that we've worked on this report at Park People, is really around this impact of tight budgets and the impact of aging infrastructure. It's always the top concern from cities that we get every single year. And this year, while we found that the pandemic didn't reduce park budgets, kind of like in real dollars and cents terms, it did cause more pressure on cities because they needed to stretch those dollars even further to cover a number of new public health related needs, like ensuring physical distancing, extra sanitation, maintenance costs from increased park use. And we also heard that some of these effects may linger for years as well. So 93% of cities said that the pandemic impacted capital budgets by either delaying park improvement projects, so making them take a much longer time, or increasing the cost of materials, so making parks more expensive to build. There is a positive note in all of this, which is that there's also very high support from the public for increased park funding. Nearly 90% of city residents want more public funding for parks. And this was really split between maintenance, like extra maintenance dollars, and more dollars for higher quality designs. The other thing that's really interesting that we've seen that's kind of started before the pandemic, but was really accelerated throughout the pandemic, is that many cities are pushing forward with equity-focused investment plans, park investment plans, that take into account elements other than just growth and development, such as demographics or socioeconomic status of neighborhoods, or climate impact concerns, like which areas of cities are hotter or more susceptible to the urban heat island effect, things like that. And this type of planning is going to be even more important, we think, in an era of perhaps tighter budgets in the future, as it can really help prioritize investment to where it's most needed.
So as we can probably imagine, park engagement is one area that the pandemic has really turned on its head. So with traditional in-person methods like town halls becoming impossible, cities have been forced to adapt and get creative. And so 92% of cities noted that the pandemic has changed the way they engage communities on park projects. And this, of course, includes a heavier reliance on virtual methods like web-based engagement platforms, social media, or even sort of hybrid methods like placing QR codes in parks. And some cities told us that this has allowed them to connect with a broader audience compared to traditional in-person consultations. But in our public survey, we found that just 22% of city residents said that they felt they have a voice or ability to influence what goes on in their local parks. So it's clear that these new methods aren't working for everyone. And the main barriers to participation that survey respondents mentioned included being unsure how to get involved, unsure whether their participation would make a difference, and having a lack of time to participate. And it's worth noting that these barriers were disproportionately experienced by respondents who identified as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. But on a more promising note, the hard work of community advocates to raise awareness around inequities during the pandemic has really pushed some cities forward. So 35% of cities told us that they're prioritizing more intentional outreach to equity deserving groups as a result of this sort of new awareness. And cities are beginning to recognize that this requires new approaches. So we're starting to see cities think more critically about finding ways to share power with communities, including a shift towards deeper ongoing relationship building with residents rather than simply engaging on a sort of one-off project by project basis. So as many of us have probably observed in our own cities, encampments have become much more visible during the pandemic, with not only sort of the economic fallout, but also challenges in the shelter system around capacity limits and public health requirements. And this is something we explored in depth in our 2020 Canadian City Parks report, which highlighted how cities can move towards more inclusive approaches to people sheltering in parks. But unfortunately, 2 years later, we're still seeing that parks departments are really struggling with this issue. So 70% of cities told us that they're overwhelmed with managing public complaints related to encampments. 56% said that they feel they lack adequate training or knowledge to meaningfully engage with houselessness. And 48% told us that they lack an overarching strategic vision for engaging with encampments beyond just sort of managing day-to-day realities on the ground. So in this context where park staff are feeling really ill-equipped to respond to this issue, we're seeing that surveillance and enforcement-based approaches continue to dominate. So we asked cities about strategies that they use to respond to houselessness, and 76% of cities said that they use bylaw enforcement. 66% said that they use crime prevention through environmental design, also known as CEPTED, which is a design strategy that aims to prevent crime and maintain order in public space, but it often has the effect of targeting survival behaviors. So for example, making it uncomfortable for people to sleep in parks. And this is all compared to only 10% of cities that said that they actually engage directly with unhoused communities. So it's clear that there's a lot of work to be done here in shifting towards more human rights-based approaches. But on a more promising note, in our survey of the Canadian public, we actually found that 62% of city residents who had noticed an encampment in their local park said that it did not negatively impact their park use. So in other words, the majority of people are actually okay with sharing park space with their unhoused neighbors. And I think this really challenges the perception that when a park is home to an encampment, other people can't use it. These survey stats highlight that people are actually much more open than we might think. And with that, I will turn it back over to Zahra to open up our discussion.
Awesome. Well, first of all, thanks, folks, and feel free to put some love in the chat for our amazing co-authors and the one who's not here physically with us right now. But I just, I think you've covered it so well, and there's so much in this report. Like, you've done such a great job of just giving us a window into what we can find, and giving us a chance to learn from all of you today. So I just, before we get into the conversation, want to remind folks that you can use the Q&A to nudge me to ask these great folks some questions, and I'll incorporate them into our discussion. So maybe I'll start off with just like a broad question just around the theme of this year. And, the theme is nurturing relationships and reciprocity. And in the context of the stories that you've surfaced and that you've heard from different folks, what does that mean? Like, what does nurturing relationships and reciprocity actually mean? And I'll put it to anyone to start.
Okay, I'll go first. So most of my work was around nature connection and spending time in nature. And I've done this kind of research for a while now, like almost a decade. And I've read a lot of reports and studies about the benefits of nature. And they're usually all from the perspective of what nature can do for us, right? It's like a very human-centered kind of personal well-being narrative. And I've fallen into that trap as well, kind of thinking and writing about this issue over the years. But a lot of the conversations I had and doing some of the research for this report kind of flipped that. And it was a good reminder to recognize that a lot of that is kind of this sort of extractive thinking. And then we need to think about it more of as a relationship. And in particular, an interview I did with Carolyn Crawley, who's a forest therapy guide. She's a storyteller and educator who runs her own consulting practice. I'll drop a link in the chat after this. She said to me that we have an individual and collective responsibility to be in a good relationship with the earth, just as well as being in a good relationship with ourselves and each other. And that phrase has really stuck with me. It's like very simple, but it's very powerful, and thinking about how we have to nurture relationships, not just with our human loved ones, but also with the earth, and that these kind of healthy relationships that we have are really built on these ideas of reciprocity and trust. And she even talked about kind of the language that we use. So calling soil and earth dirt, for example, which I have totally done before. And she was just saying, like, does that actually convey kind of respect for the soil and all it offers us by sort of calling it dirt? So just being kind of more thoughtful about our actions and our words, and kind of how we position ourselves in relation to all the other beings that we share this environment with. And that's really kind of what this idea of reciprocity has meant to me through this report.
Amazing. Just makes me think, Jake, I remember we had a panel with Carolyn, and I remember even also her talking about sort of the reframe around complete communities, and saying, High Park, as an example, was always a complete community. It was a pharmacy, it was a grocery store, it was all the things that we need, depending on the perspective and worldview that you bring. So So thanks for sharing that. Emily or Adri, we all don't have to answer every question, but I just want to put it to you to take some space on this question.
I can take this one. Yeah, I guess reciprocity for us, I mean, in Plains Cree or Nihiawewin would probably be translated to Wakotawin, which is our kinship with each other, and that kinship is with humans and non-human beings too. And all of our kind of teachings or ceremonies connect us, or intended to connect us to that extended kinship and obligate us too. So I think and everything we talk about, it's about relationships, but also responsibility. So yeah, even in my story, I was thinking about how plants have a right to be in parks too. Like Indigenous plants have the right to be in urban spaces just as much as people. And how do we think about our animals have the right to be in city spaces too, and bugs, even like the word we have for bugs is manichos, which is a derivative of Manitou, which is our word for God, like little gods too. So if we think about things in the language, it really orients us to connection and to that reciprocity with other beings too.
Adri, you look like you're going to jump in.
Yeah, well, I am now just feeling guilty about the fly that I tried to kill a little bit before we started this panel after Emily's comment. But yeah, so in my work, I worked on the research around houselessness, and coming back to that stat around how we found that only 10% of parks departments are actually engaging directly with unhoused communities on park projects. I just wanted to highlight an example that I covered in one of the stories that I personally found really inspiring around the theme of relationships. So the Vancouver Park Board has just created a new position within the park board called the Director of Urban Relationships. And that role is entirely focused on sort of engaging with encampment residents as well as community partners who work with those folks. And I had the privilege of interviewing Donnie Rosa, who's the GM of the Vancouver Park Board. And they were talking about how traditionally in the park sector, we've approached houselessness through a very operational lens. So for example, often the people making decisions about encampments are people who are maybe trained in natural resource management, and their skill set is really around park service levels and maintaining the grass and things like that. And all of a sudden they're thrown into this role where they're dealing with these really complex issues and this very human issue that doesn't necessarily lend itself to an operational approach. And so I think that Donnie just made the excellent point around how this is a relationships issue, and we need to have the skill sets within parks departments or parks boards to engage with it in that way. And so that was sort of something that stuck out to me around the report theme.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, all. And as all of you were speaking, but Emily in particular, when you were speaking, I just started writing all the words, right? Dirt, bug, weed, they're just, they don't indicate sort of, they don't honor the creatures as community members, but something to be removed, right? And so it does, it just makes me think of what you just said, Adri, which is how do we think about not necessarily only taking a maintenance and risk management approach, but taking what are all the community members and what relationships should we have? What's the nature of the relationships that we have with all of the humans and more than human kinfolk, that are in the parks. So I have so many questions. I'm trying to narrow them down. I'm going to start with the piece that I'm always curious about, because all of you and all the folks working on the report, Jake, you said it, right? You've done this work, you've studied it, you've read other reports, you've written these, you've all co-authored things in this vein, just like the Canadian City Parks Report over the years. And so it's always interesting to hear what disarmed you, what surprised you, what sort of, Adri, you started to speak to that. But what was the piece of the report, whether it was a piece of data or just a learning or an insight from a story or interview that really stuck out to you? Anyone? Maybe we'll start with Emily, because I'm looking at you. You're right in the middle of my screen.
Yeah, a few things I was really surprised that 22% of folks not feeling like they understand how to get engaged with city parks. And I'm sure if we, I think that would be even lower if we're talking about Indigenous people understanding how to get involved in city processes too, which is something that I do work on just with my work in the public library, and we're funded by funded by Edmonton or the city of Edmonton. So trying to get Indigenous people involved in these processes. But also I talked a little bit about my piece, how like municipalities and non-Indigenous groups also have to like travel a little bit to where we're at, and our own processes that we use too. So I think that was surprising. And then surprised that folks were keen to have Indigenous plants in parks too, and kind of inherently understood their importance and utility.
Yeah, it's amazing. I actually, Emily, I will say that when I was reading the report, that stuck out to me too, because it makes you curious about the depth of knowledge that people have and their why, right? If it's coming from the spirit of reciprocity, which is really cool. Adri, Jake.
Yeah, it's a stat that Adri mentioned briefly already, which is the one that kind of stuck out to me when I was looking at the results of the survey when they came in, was that 58% of people said that they were dissatisfied with the amount of time they spent in parks because they want to spend more time in parks. And we're already seeing like historic highs in park use in the last couple of years in Canada and around North America. And so the idea that people wanted to spend even more time in parks was so fascinating to me. But it also made me think about what were the reasons that these folks were dissatisfied and didn't feel like they could spend that extra time in parks, right? Like I would really love to be able to find out what the barriers are that people are experiencing that prevent them from spending the amount of time that they want to spend in parks. Is it time? I talked to Zamani Ra, who's an environmental educator, and she sort of was talking this idea of time poverty, which I had never heard about before, where people are just they don't have like the time to do the things that they want or to do the things that they need. And this might fall into that category. Of course, access issues. Maybe the parks nearby don't have the appropriate amenities for them. Maybe they have kids and there's no playground nearby or whatever it is. So I'm just fascinated that people want to spend even so much more time in parks, and sort of what are the reasons why they're not able to do that, I think would be something fascinating to kind of dig into for next year.
Yeah.
A surprising stat for me, which actually came from a third survey that informed the report that I didn't mention, which is our community park group survey. So we also do an annual survey of all of the sort of grassroots park friends groups that we work with across the country. And this year we had over 150 responses. And so when we asked cities about their relationship with local community groups, 63% of cities said that they had a strong relationship with these park groups. But then when we asked the same question to the park groups themselves, only 44% of them said that they had a strong relationship with the city. So, and it's worth noting that for community groups that identified as equity deserving, this was even lower at 38%. So it just highlighted for me a little bit of a disconnect in terms of how strong cities might perceive their relationships with communities versus how strong communities perceive their relationships with cities. And I think highlights an opportunity for cities to maybe do a little bit more work in engaging with these groups. And the good news is that 83% of these groups said that they actually would like to deepen their relationship with their municipality. And they had some just like very simple suggestions around, like making it clear to folks how you request a new bench in your park, or even just having a designated contact at the city to liaise with. So just really a lot of simple solutions that I think cities could put in place to just leverage all of the energy that these groups have to contribute to their local parks.
Adri, that stat just makes me think of, I think maybe something we spoke about a little while back when you were working on the report, which is, finding ways for municipalities to make the transactional more seamless. So anytime they can focus on picking up the phone when someone calls and just talking folks through things. And I think, across all aspects of liaising with institutions, that tends to be an amazing entry point when you have a phone number and you have an email address and you can just call someone and call a human and ask. So you're right. It doesn't have to be like so transformative to actually start to sort of nurture some of that social infrastructure and connection. And just, Adri, while you have the floor, Catherine Barris had a question just around this term of houselessness, because what Catherine has shared here is previously the popular term seemed to be those experiencing homelessness. And for her, house seems like it may not be as inclusive. Is an apartment a house? Can you explain your use of the term? So would you mind just elaborating a little bit on the choice of nomenclature?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if everyone's answer to this would be the same as mine, but from my perspective, I've learned through working with folks with lived experience that a lot of them actually do locate their sense of home in parks. So it feels a little bit inaccurate to, describe it as homelessness when someone actually feels at home in a park. So it's to sort of, I guess, point to more the physical structure of like a shelter versus the sense of home, which people very much find in public spaces. And there's actually an amazing quote from an expert with lived experience named Matthew Huxley, who talks about how it's actually like necessary to find a sense of home in public spaces, and like folks that he knows kind of carve out a little home for themselves, even if it's like under an underpass or something like that. And they very much like feel that that's their home. And so my personal sense is like, I just sort of take direction from folks with lived experience, but it's a really good point. And I'm sure there are other people who have other thoughts on this as well. I had something else to say, but I forget now, but I remember what I was going to say is also Jesse Thistle's work on the definition of Indigenous homelessness really points to how for many Indigenous peoples, like the experience of homelessness is like kind of about all of these interconnected factors related to like disconnection from land and disconnection from kinship and culture. And so it's much deeper and more complex than the sort of Western definition of like not having a home or not having a roof over your head. So yeah, sorry if that was rambling.
No, that was great. That was like, it's also nice to get into your thought process too, because I think, we're doing our best to honor the perspectives of those that whose stories need to be increasingly more told and should be, and so I think that's really the spirit of this report. So thanks so much, Adri. So I have a couple more questions, but I am seeing questions come in. So don't worry, I'm coming to those ones next. So the next question I just it's a question I also want to bring attention to it, which is there's the report, and the report is absolutely outstanding. And then there's these accompanying stories. And if you start clicking through all of them, they are just a wealth of knowledge. You hear about specific folks leading change that I, just was like thoroughly enjoying, and thought it might be cool to have each of you share sort of what's one story or specific project that you heard about through the research that you think other cities could learn from or other communities could learn from, because there's so many and they're so great, but what are the ones that excited each of you the most?
Yeah, there were so many that I learned about through my interviews, and then also again from reading Emily, Nikita, and Adri's work. But in terms of the people that I talked to, I got the chance to talk to Carrie Crow and Paul Gauthier about their work on accessible nature programming for one of the stories that I wrote. And they spent a lot of time ensuring that people with various disabilities could access nature wellness programming, even from home or even from bed if they weren't able to get to the park. Carrie was talking about people not always feeling, safe or comfortable, especially during a pandemic, to visit a park space, maybe getting on transit. Maybe the park is inaccessible when they get there. Maybe it's too busy and they don't feel, they're immunocompromised or something, and they don't feel comfortable kind of being in a park space. And so they're not able to access these, natural wellness benefits that, many other people are able to, going for a walk along a trail or something. So they did a lot of work through audio and video workshops, bringing images and sounds and inviting people to kind of discover nature in their own way, in their own home or at a space nearby. And they're now working to kind of expand that program by training people themselves to kind of lead those workshops. So it's this like really lovely kind of like growing practice that they've built. And I was really inspired by that. And it wasn't something that I thought about a lot before. And I think it's really instructive for folks, doing nature programming to think about those access issues, right? Because I think a lot of cities offer, stewardship programs, come in and, invasive weeding or go on this nature walk or whatever. And, how can we actually make those programs kind of more inclusive and more accessible for folks who might not be able to participate in the actual outdoor activity in the same way that others might. So I thought that program was amazing and really instructive for other folks.
Cool. Also makes me think of a colleague of mine who does work in the accessibility space and has accessibility needs himself, and talked about how we used to call up museums and galleries and be like, can you put your show online? And they're like, it's not possible. And so now all the impossible things are possible, and maintaining the reality to create the accessibility through being able to access it virtually and go there physically is the question. Can we hold that space, as we emerge into this next stage of the pandemic? Adri, Emily, some of your favorite stories that folks could learn from?
I really like Adri's story on parks as a site of care, and I think that's something we saw really grow during the pandemic. Is meeting community where they're at and providing care. Even there's a park close to my house that had like a community fridge. So there's been a lot of that work over the pandemic and before too. I think we think a lot of about vulnerable communities in parks and not about all the like amazing work that those communities are doing to support each other. Even thinking about, like, I lived in Vancouver for a long time, and parks near the downtown east side, like those are the communities that there is actual community and people are caring for each other. It is with vulnerable populations a lot of the time. And then I think Jake's story on nature connectedness, because I think that's something that Indigenous people think a lot about, but I don't know if it's something that settlers really like trying to philosophize their connection to land and then connection to Indigenous people who are stewards of that land too. So surprised to see the high statistics of people that felt that kind of nature connectedness. And I think that's an opportunity for us to think about, like, what does that mean, and to foster kind of stewardship of land and urban spaces for us to all care for it.
Yeah, that's a great wink into next year's report, maybe, like, just really going deeper on that question, like when people say they have that connection, what constitutes it, which is incredibly intriguing. Yeah, thanks, Emily.
I could add on just one example from the interviews that really stood out to me. So since Emily mentioned her experience in the downtown east side, I actually had the privilege of speaking with Robbie Epp, who is a founder of a group called Sweetgrass Clan, and they work in Vancouver's downtown east side, sort of providing outreach and support to folks in parks and public spaces who might be experiencing different vulnerabilities. And he talked about how they draw on traditional cultural teachings to sort of approach situations that like crisis situations as like from a place of deep empathy. And he actually described it as reaching into people. And so for me, that really highlighted just that there are real, tangible, practical solutions to help people feel safe that don't necessarily involve policing, which I think is an area that, there's been a lot of dialogue about in the past few years. And so, yeah, I just felt really lucky to have that conversation, because for me, it was just very satisfying to know that there are these real, tangible alternatives that are making a difference on the ground and actually helping people feel safe, which we know policing does not, necessarily make everyone feel safe. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Adri, that makes me think of the conversation we had maybe a few months ago, just talking about how, just anecdotes about different communities in the Toronto area where folks have big front yards and big backyards, and they were actually the big advocates, the fervent advocates of saying, encampments should stay. Like, we aren't using the ravine as much as, other folks are. Like, we're happy to welcome these folks into our community. And it's another way of framing it, right? Like, what does everyone, it's very, take what you need, not what you want, right? Of sort of a different or a worldview that doesn't often exist in some of our systems. I'm going to go to a question from an audience member, Regan or Reagan. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. Flavel is asking us here to share your thoughts on ways we can imagine a balance between indigenizing spaces, for instance, including meadows in prairies, and providing programmable spaces, in quotes, programmable spaces, usually viewed by cities as more manicured. I'm finding that the maintenance drives a lot of design in municipal settings, and cities seem to struggle with understanding how to maintain native plantings. So much is given over to sod and relatively sterile communities of plants. So that's sort of what appears like a tension around indigenizing spaces and programming spaces. Can we reflect on that together, Emily?
Yeah, I can start. I'm not a landscape architect, so I feel like my answer is limited, but I'm not sure. I think that tension exists for cities, but I'm not sure it exists if we are creative about space use. I think I've seen a lot of spaces where there are all native plants, and instead of sod, we're using gravel for programmable areas, or Indigenous architects making spaces that are enclosed or things like that in parks. So I think, like, for me, I always think that grass or sod requires so much more maintenance actually than Indigenous plants. And I think about my dad's very manicured backyard that he spends so much time on. So I think this is a big project for the next probably few decades for us to creatively think about spaces having Indigenous plants. And even I was just thinking about Kechiaski here in Edmonton, which is I think is going to open in the fall, which is an Indigenous ceremonial space in a city park. And I think we still have sod, even though they're kind of thinking about Indigenous plants. But yeah, I don't have all the answers for that, but I think that I think creatively we could figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to point out that like cities like Edmonton and others who are like very much have been focused on kind of finding spaces in parks to increase naturalization. Kelowna is also doing this. Vancouver has started some low-mow meadows in different parks. One of the reasons like given is around, sometimes it is around and actually saving on maintenance, you know, like once the native plant garden is more established, it does require less water, it does require sort of less, you know, care and attention as you would, as Emily pointed out, like a grassy field. And it just like provides a whole host of other benefits. Like we're just talking about climate resilience, you know, water retention in a naturalized meadow is higher than in a grassy area. You also get a larger cooling effect on the urban heat island effect in an area that has a more naturalized plantings and a denser plant bed than you would with just like a shorn kind of like grass field. So there's, you know, a whole host of benefits from climate to even kind of operational benefits that come with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it also makes me think that there's a reframe that's needed, right, around like when we do bring Indigenous plants into these spaces, they're pretty happy, right? They spread, they take the space, they reclaim their land. And so even reframing, you know, how they take the space and not containing them is an interesting exercise for parks maintenance people who might just weed or like take things out that are actually really happy and thriving. So it's a shift in our mental model. I do just want permission for like 4 minutes to detour into nerding out on process, because so much thought goes into like how this report gets structured and how the research happens, how we do the surveys and the interviews and all the different component parts. And so, you know, I remember conversations last year about really thinking through how to more deeply embed equity and an equity lens across all of the work that we do on this report. And I do remember a conversation about our ambition last year to continue to deepen the equity lens. So I'd love to know, like, you know, go bananas on the how. Tell us a little bit about how you thought about sort of continuing to shift and deepen and evolve our equity lens on how we do this research. And Adri, I kind of want to start with you. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I know you're a fellow process nerd. So maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, like, I guess I would start by just going back to when we were even conceiving of the stories for this year's report. You know, the report is structured around these 5 themes of nature, inclusion, growth, activation, and collaboration. And really, like, when we were trying to think about what topics we were going to go deep into, which then of course informed all of the process pieces around survey design and whatnot, I think we were really intentional about ensuring that we were approaching each section with an equity lens, not just the inclusion section. So for example, like the activation section, which is usually about park programming and like creative ways that people are, I don't know, bringing people together in parks, instead of making it about like, I don't know, community festivals or street conversions, we made it about houselessness and mutual aid networks. And that's not really something that you might think of when you think of park activation, but we thought it was an important perspective to highlight. And I feel like others can speak to how that showed up in their own sections. But I also just like personally like to think of all of the surveys that we do as, you know, when people are taking a survey, whether they're a municipal staff or a member of the public, even just the way you frame questions can frame how people think about parks. So just trying to, I guess, like also use even just our methods of data collection as a bit of an opportunity to like prompt reflection among folks taking the surveys is another piece that we thought about. And then like also just very technical things, like obviously we compensate all of our interviewees and we compensate community groups that provide photos for the report and whatnot, just, you know, in the spirit of reciprocity, they share so much knowledge with us. So yeah, those are some initial thoughts, but Jake and Emily, feel free to add on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have too much to add to that, except I think, you know, last year we spent a lot of time thinking about the equity impacts of the pandemic. And I think this year it was sort of like moving forward from those in an intentional way, like learning from what happened during the pandemic and still through an equity lens, thinking about how to kind of move forward. So like in my story around investment in parks and sustainable park funding, really kind of like spotlighting the work that cities are beginning to do or have, you know, done in the last year or two around planning for a like equity-led investment in parks. You know, changing the way that they make decisions about where parks go, from just thinking about, oh, this neighborhood is growing super fast, so that's where the parks, like that's where the money is going to go, which is obviously important. You know, growing neighborhoods need parks, but that, you know, leaves many other neighborhoods out often. And over time, we see, you know, certain areas becoming more green than others. So kind of coming to terms with that, which was absolutely something that was highlighted a lot during the pandemic, right? When people were accessing parks a lot more, like which neighborhoods were greener and which were not. It became very stark. So I think people have learned from that and I'm really heartened to see the different elements that are going into some of these park investment plans around climate and income and other factors that I haven't seen before, that I hope will lead to more kind of resilient and equitable park systems in the next like decade or so.
Emily, anything to add, or have your colleagues covered it all?
I think that's great, yeah.
Well, I'm trying to weigh how many questions we can sneak in because they're coming in hot in the Q&A. Maybe I'll just borrow part of Robert's question because I think we want to talk about that anyways. There's, you know, Robert from the city of Kelowna says, great report, well done. Co-sign that, Robert, and was just saying, you know, have you started to think about any initial areas of focus? And what he's saying is, there's a particular interest in Kelowna around the commercialization of parks because of the challenges to fund park infrastructure, and that they're looking for alternate funding sources. I think a lot of municipalities are. And so the commercial leases provide much needed revenues to add to vitalization, but is highly contentious and takes away from the park space and leisure environment. And maybe even, I would like posit to say even some of that, the collective, the mandate around sort of collectivism and shared space. So can we hint at what we might be thinking about for next year's report, areas of focus that have started to emerge? And you've already touched on a few, but if any of you want to elaborate, that would be awesome.
I guess I'll go first. Yeah, like Robert, was that from Kelowna?
Yeah.
Was that who? Yeah, you're right. Like that was something that I was thinking about a lot when I was working on the sustainable park funding story, is just like the different ways that cities might be turning to fund parks over the next couple of years, as we hopefully don't, but perhaps get into some austerity budgeting. And parks, as now Lobley, who's the director of parks and cemeteries for Kitchener, pointed out, unfortunately, parks are usually kind of first up for budget cuts. So we all have to be very vigilant about that over the next couple of years. We have done some work actually in past reports on commercial activity in parks from the point of view of local economic development. So like where it can actually be, you know, perhaps a net positive and done when it's done well. That was a story that Adri worked on last year. And I did some work last year also that you might be interested in reading about on private funding and partnerships in parks, and kind of the very careful dance that needs to happen at cities when working with foundations or private funders in parks. It can do some good, and it can also, of course, do some damage sometimes as well. But I think that would be an interesting thing to look. It sounds like you're talking a lot about like the actual like licenses and leases in parks to perhaps businesses that might operate in parks and things like that, and maybe taking over some of the services that cities might have offered previously. I'm just maybe reading into your question a little bit, but that would be something interesting to look at. The thing that I really wanted to do this year, but we didn't get a chance to, that I really hope to do next year, is dive into queer experiences in parks. It's not a topic that we've really touched on a lot in the past. So queer experiences in parks, programming, queer spaces. I got to go back to Pride this year after 2 years or so of having it not be around, and just being out in parks and public spaces with other queer folks was just such a nice experience to have again. And it reminded me why parks and public spaces are so important to the queer community. Something I've personally experienced over the years, and obviously that experience is quite uneven. But I think that's something that I would love to explore further, what different cities are doing around that. I know, Vancouver has taken some steps towards making park washrooms and other spaces more queer friendly. But that's something that I would love to dive into in next year's report.
Emily's already offered up the first interviewee in the chat. Adri or Emily, no pressure to respond, but any areas of focus for the next one that you're excited about?
I'll try and keep it quick because I know we're running out of time, but just I'm really interested in experiences of safety in parks, like picking up on that comment earlier around sort of the work of Sweetgrass Patrol in the downtown east side. Also through the research on houselessness, just learning a little bit about what makes parks feel safe to people in encampments. It goes against a lot of planning conventions and sort of what we might expect to create safety in parks. So often parks are designed to create like open sight lines so that people can like see each other. But if you don't actually have a private space and you're relying on parks to be your private space, then things like bushes to provide visual protection or dark areas in parks to provide like a good night's sleep are actually really important to your sense of safety and security. So I think just like unpacking what safety means and how that looks different for different people would be a really interesting topic to dig into next year.
Super cool. We are so low on time, and I'm going to hold on to my last question, which is like, what do you want people to take away? What do you want the decision makers on this call to take away? So Adri, Jake, and Emily, if you want to put it in the chat, if there is like one thing that you just want people to like keep in their hearts and minds as they like read the report and step away and try and action on it, that would be beautiful. But you've already done so much work with us just on this webinar, sharing your wisdom. I'm going to begin to close us as you folks reflect on that question. I first want to say, of course, thank you so much for producing this incredible piece of work, and an extended thank you to all of the folks that fed into this and shared their stories and shared their wisdom, and all the people that responded to the survey. If you're on the call and you did, thank you for being a part of it. For folks in the audience, if you don't mind just putting a word of gratitude into the chat, just like one word that's like how you're feeling, or just a thank you or something just for our amazing co-authors, that would be great. They've been on quite a journey to bring this to life, and so just be nice to fill them with that energy. I'll just share a couple things as we near the end of our time here. If we could pull up just the slide about our amazing conference coming up. Shameless plug for, proud plug for our upcoming conference in September. And it will be a virtual conference, Build an Abundant Future for City Parks, which I think if you came here today, you are very interested in, I am sure. It will take place online from September 21st to 23rd, and it'll bring together park professionals, community park group leaders, nonprofit organizations, municipal staff, and urban enthusiasts to create an abundant future for city parks. Register online, the information's all on our website, and cultivate new ways to build partnerships, attract resources, create park spaces, and deliver more impact in city parks. And I'll just give a quick anecdote that is actually the the way I got more meaningfully involved with park people, just by coming to the conference and being part of the community. It's one of these really unique spaces where you really get sort of the cross-pollination of all these different folks that want to help see community thrive. So it's a really special space to just come and be a part of, even virtually. I just want to say a quick thanks again to everyone who showed up today to listen to this report. And we really just to listen to sort of just all these key insights and the beautiful wisdom shared by our co-authors. And we hope that all these ideas will start to carry with you into the important work that you do. And a shout out to each and every one of you and for the work that you do in the parks in your communities, because we are sure that it makes a tremendous impact on contributing to vital civic life. So read the report, read the stories, enjoy the work, be in touch with the Park People team, and have a wonderful rest of your day and weekend.